My presentation today is actually throwing a bit of a spin on the water issue, and actually speaks to a number of topics and the way we deal with cities going into the future. And in times of crisis, we often find ourselves wanting to find an immediate solution. We want to find the right technology, we want to apply it and solve the problem. For many cities around the world, they've actually dealt with crises by actually reframing the whole question, rewriting the whole equation of what they're trying to solve. And in particular for the way Cape Town and South African cities operate, this is actually a moment, having this drought, having this crisis, to actually rethink how we operate, how we build, how we regenerate the city going forward. And actually through this process, not just asking how do we get enough water in a dam, because currently, the way our cities work and the way our country works is in Cape Town, we wait for energy to come from Mpumalanga to come down to Cape Town. We wait for a dam to fill up in a municipality not actually defined as Cape Town. And we try to solve the whole region's water supply by waiting for a dam to fill up about 50 kilometers away. And the same with our food security. In Cape Town, for example, more than half the vegetables come from Philippi, which is 20-minute drive away. So by actually reframing how our city actually works, we actually find a solution and a way forward to a number of environmental resource constraints in our cities today. And so the way we respond in this crisis right now will have lasting impacts for the next few decades in Cape Town and other South African cities. As mentioned today, there are drought implications in a number of cities. So we're going to look at a number of cities and how they actually responded to this. And in our particular case, I believe that Cape Town, and not just Cape Town, but the region and the city region, could actually end up with more water and more energy than it needs if we change our processes and actually change the way we work, the way we collaborate, and the way we move together as business, as public sector, and as private sector. So just to bring us to the context of this African continent that we live in and we work in, and we will continue to work in. So it's sort of the number five seems to appear a lot. In the year 2050, more than half of the population of the African continent will live in cities. We know that in Cape Town, for example, the population will reach, I believe it's 5 million by 2040. In addition to this growing population in African cities, we know that more than half of the population is under the age of 18 and a half. So it's a very, very young population. And in that is both a challenge with employment, but also an immense opportunity. Young people love embracing change and innovation much more quicker than the older generation do. 90% are aged between 15 and 24 years old. And then very interesting statistic is 60% of what still needs to be built in 2050 still has to be built. So we're not a city, a country, a continent in which everything is complete. We still have to build 60% of the built environment. And again, this is where the opportunity to transform comes in again. And looking to the future, there are four mega trends which I always sort of repeat, because in any challenge we face, whether we're working on a new mobility solution for Cape Town or planning a new part or a district, looking at new inclusive housing approaches, there are things that are going to happen in the future, or things that already we are experiencing, which we just need to remind ourselves of, because they will shape everything, not just water or food security, but actually shape the way we live and work and the way we move. So the first is the fourth industrial revolution. That just speaks about the shift in the digital economy, right? So which industries will be impacted by ICT? Which companies won't be around in the next 5-10 years? Where will we work? What work will we do? How will the digital infrastructure change that completely? And I thought about a very interesting case for Cape Town, and not just for Cape Town, but cities around the world, is if we can start to work anywhere, and not just talking about working from home, but working from multiple locations. If movement became very easy, you could move between 7 different locations in one day. Do we still need commercial buildings? And how many more commercial buildings do we need? Do we need office space? And how many more buildings will have specifically one use? So if we've shifted into this fourth industrial revolution, our entire concept of work and play and live will shift entirely. We won't just be working from home, we're working from a number of locations, because Wi-Fi will be great everywhere. Mobility won't really be an issue. So this will shift not just how we work, but the skills we have, which skills will become relevant into the future. Again, climate change, there are rising carbon emissions. We've seen the implications of many countries like the US pulling out of these major Paris agreements. So we'll be having to do more to sort of deal with rising carbon emissions. And this places a number of constraints, not just on governments to build more efficiently and to build with the future in mind, but actually on businesses. Have we really unpacked the implications of carbon tax on industry and business in the coming decades? And then mobility, very interestingly, we have things like Uber today, but we've seen companies already testing the first phase of the Hyperloop. So how will we move in the next few decades? And will Cape Townians be able to get to work on time? And will they start earlier? And will they get stuck in traffic? In Cape Town and South Africa in particular, we love to believe that congestion is only experienced here, and we're the only city to have a food security issue and a water security issue. And if you just look around a bit, you'll start to see that many cities face similar issues. And how do we collaborate with those cities? And again, urbanization, 900 million people are going to move into African cities in a matter of a few decades. How we deal with that, the additional pressures being placed on water infrastructure and all our environmental resources. So those four, there are many more, but those four are going to shape everything of sort of what we know and what we believed in. One particular case that I want to look at today was New York after Hurricane Sandy. We all sort of followed the media and witnessed the incredible impacts that hurricane had on Manhattan, on New Jersey, on a number of areas. The hurricane didn't just pick a particular political boundary to impact. It actually worked across the regional systems of New York. And they had a very interesting question to ask. And the one thing is, could you just build a bigger seawall? Could you just deal with water in a way where you just build a higher wall? And in fact, this is quite relevant for the US at the moment, but you just build a bigger wall and wrap the coastline of Manhattan in more seawalls. You build a better one, you build a stronger one. But what they said is, let's actually change the process of how we make and create and plan the city. So they just didn't decide to rebuild. They decided to redesign and reimagine what that wall could be and how the entire coastal protection system actually worked. And this process was called Rebuild by Design. And the HUD, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the US, I'm not sure they're still around or who's running that currently, but the process called Rebuild by Design was actually a competition. They invited not just sort of water experts, environmental experts, they invited multidisciplinary design teams from around the world, and they chose 10 of them. And in these teams, each team would have a bunch of different disciplines and experts. And they were then selected from this massive open call. This is obviously a $10 billion multi-decade infrastructure project for the US in one of its sort of most well-known and iconic cities. And these are a number of the teams they chose. They then didn't just give those teams, sort of hand out tenders. They made all the teams actually study the areas, so New Jersey, Hoboken, Manhattan, sent them into communities and say, all of you research, all of you find out what the problems are, what are the local conditions, what are the regional systems. Deal with communities, deal with coalitions, because like over here, in South Africa, there are a number of political boundaries. The one state is an entirely different state next door, across from a bridge from Manhattan. They have a number of very vocal groups. In South Africa, we have protests and we have sort of civil society, but you don't have sort of really, really strong community and design-led neighborhood groups. So they had vocal groups who had just lost everything and had to deal with somebody saying, let's redesign your community, let's look at some new ideas. And these are some of the ideas they came up with and will be implementing in the coming decades. This is by OMA and Royal Haskoning for a particular part of the city. And they said, rather than thinking of our coastline as some sort of barrier in which we just need to keep the sea out, they actually developed a number of sort of infrastructure projects and social infrastructure projects alongside this coastline, which they called, I believe, resist, delay, store, and discharge, and actually thought about, if these storms are going to become more frequent, how do we actually deal with them? How do we resist them? How do we delay the impacts? Where do people live? How close do they live? And in Cape Town, areas like Milnerton are already becoming sort of, high risk and vulnerable zones. How do we store, as mentioned by the previous speaker, and how do we discharge? So water doesn't just become this major threat, but thinking about how it works and how it impacts, suddenly you have public spaces, you have sort of a number of green interventions which actually deal with water and actually can withstand the impacts of that. This is by a very famous architect, Bjarke Ingels. He thought of the entire Manhattan coastline. He calls this the Big U, and it's sort of a 10-mile long continuous strip along which they developed a whole bunch of social and environmental infrastructure. Again, not just putting in pipes and walls and steel, but thought of the whole coastline as an opportunity in which you can develop a number of public spaces when in these extreme weather events could either store the water, could resist the impacts, could actually deal with it. So again, more of a buffer which brings water in, stores water, and recycles water in certain points as well. So rethinking how the entire city operates. This is the New Meadowlands project, which was in Jersey City. In that case, they found the regional systems and parks to be quite amazing. They said, let's actually grow the marshlands and the wetlands even further and build an environmentally relevant and sensitive buffer to these more sort of extreme frequent weather events. So again, not just trying to solve the issue of dealing with of a water crisis or an extreme weather event, actually changing the entire process of how the city works. And again, a very difficult process. I'll flip through that very quickly, but again, competing political interests, different governors, some of them are no longer there, some of them have been fired, some of them caught in scandals, vocal community groups, a number of coalitions, but they made these sort of design and research teams go into communities and actually find solutions which are feasible and viable, and again, which federal government could actually fund going forward. And we've seen a number of innovative solutions in African cities as well. This is in Lagos. It's part of Makoko, which is an informal settlement which actually is on water. And in South Africa, we often see many of our townships and slums full with water every single winter. These people live on water, and the Lagos regional government was about to demolish the entire formal settlement within 72 hours. A very famous architect, Kunle Adeyemi, actually said, well, let's just build an iconic school on top of the water. The school became iconic, it became well known around the world, and suddenly the Lagos government withdrew their order to demolish the entire informal settlement. Again, using a very interesting process to simply change the way the city works. And a number of communities across Africa through the African Water Cities project are rethinking their relationship to water and how the city responds to that. This is I believe, a community center with a radio station for the local community, which deals with the rising water levels. This is called Aqua City by an architecture company, where they actually extend the entire city into the water on a number of piers. The additional neighborhood starts to bring in water and deal with the rising sea levels, both storing and again recycling. So expanding the city rather than defending and holding back in terms of the crisis. Looking at a city which is recognized around the world in terms of its ability to transform its entire water supply, and this is very interesting. Singapore, in the 1960s, a new president or a new prime minister, they really didn't have a water supply in the way we think of it today. They I think it was about 55 to 60% of their water supply came from Malaysia, so next door. So they were entirely dependent on another country, a neighboring state, to provide their water. Similar to Cape Town, I suppose, in a way. They're about 5.5 million population. They're an island nation, and they had no choice around how to reframe the entire water infrastructure. So they went through a number of processes, and today, sort of multiple decades later, they're recognized globally as a city which transformed their entire water supply, not through sort of rocket science and the latest tech, but actually just a step process into the future and changing the way things were structured. They centralized their water management firstly. In the 70s, they realized that they had to start recycling. At the time, I believe the recycling technology wasn't quite affordable for Singapore. And what they did was they focused on their sewage system and their wastewater system. They separated sewage from the groundwater. Another challenge they faced was they didn't have areas for catchments or a groundwater supply. So like Cape Town, we have dams and rivers and oceans. They didn't have catchment areas. Their rivers were contaminated. And because they're such a small island, there wasn't sort of large amounts of space in which to plan new dams. So they had to regenerate the entire river system and think about around new catchments. So they actually demarcated zones in which these areas would grow into becoming catchments for water one day. And so they actually use a number of actually quite conventional approaches to their water management and water supply. And then only in 2000, when recycling became viable and technology became affordable to Singapore, then they started adding the recycling opportunity of recycling water and reusing what they have and recovering that water. And then I think in about 2005, only then they started looking at desalination. So again, when we're looking at Cape Town and the water crisis, we're looking at what is the right process for the future of the city region, not by political boundaries or by metropolitan boundaries. What is the process in the next few decades which doesn't just transform water, but transforms the way the city works and the processes which works, if we want that sort of transformation of the water supply to actually get more water, more food, more energy than we actually need in the coming decades, and not simply just trying to sort of get by what the demand is going to be. So another thing we do at Future Cape Town is actually look for research in the areas they're not meant to come from. So we looked for research about the water supply of Cape Town in an area that came from the spatial planning department. So planners, how do planners deal with the water supply? And it was very interesting what they came up with. This is actually, if you go to futurecapetown.com, this is actually on our website over here. But again, I mentioned earlier, we're all sort of so focused on filling up our dams and getting our power stations to work. But again, our food could come as close as 20 minutes away. Our water is coming from a dam, which we're all hoping will fill up with rain, and our energy comes from Mpumalanga. And we think that sort of somehow is going to sustain us into the future if we just build enough energy and fill up our dams further away. So this is actually this is a Sankey diagram, and I'm not an expert on this, but it just shows you that where the water comes from, and the thickness of each line is where the water is being used. And what we see is actually it's a linear water supply, as mentioned by the previous speaker. We're just sort of filling up a central space. Industry, you'll see that residential, for example, use the large amounts of water, and in particular middle income and high income residential uses lots of water. So they just mapped where the water goes, where the water flows out into. And so what we have is a linear water supply where we are using water, not really sure where it's going, not really recovering, not into recycling. They found that actually two things could actually change the entire system of how we supply water into the future. The first was actually three. The most important part, as I mentioned earlier, is actually not the technology or the infrastructural solution. It's actually the socio-economic political transition to change minds, to change processes, to change agencies. We know that sometimes national agencies struggle to cooperate with business, or national and local are fighting about a particular issue. So the first step is actually a socio-economic political transition in how we work. And a crisis often provides, as we mentioned earlier, the best chance to get those transitions and cooperations to work. And then two particular points these planners raised. Well, the first was local storage. So how do buildings, districts, communities start to store water locally? And rather than waiting for, again, a dam to fill up, which is 50 kilometers away. And secondly, recycling, just recovering water can actually deal with a lot of the issues. So in Cape Town, for example, even 5 years ago, when you look at new precincts being developed, I think for about 6 city blocks, the council responded and said to them, you actually have to think of your own water supply, because we simply can't put in the bulk infrastructure which will accommodate you into the future. So this is both a challenge for business in terms of the cost, but also an opportunity to become leaders in how we work with water. So two things, local storage and recycling. And what they've estimated is that in the next few decades, by just following those two approaches, you could actually end up with more water supply than Cape Town needs in 20 or 30 years. So the future is complex, but it requires complex cooperation. This is where us as humans start to struggle. Our future, as mentioned, in terms of the context of Africa and South Africa, is complex. It's intertwined, but all of us are hoping and praying that the same sort of entities and agencies and corporations will work. What we actually need is new approaches and new methods and new corporations. And I think for business, this is where a big question is, how do you get involved with the Future Water Institute at UCT, which has just formed, I think, in the last 6 months, to bring a whole bunch of different kinds of researchers together? How do you get involved with an NGO, which is looking at innovation in city planning, for example? How do you start to look at your own precincts and your own buildings? Where are they located in regards to public transport? How does your building recycle water? How does your building and your precinct become entirely sort of water independent? And I think if we start to address the processes rather than just trying to solve a crisis, we actually end up with a future city that shifts the way we live, shifts the way we do business, and shifts the way we move and work. Thank you.